to talk with you today about the role of top management and the role of business and link that to strategy. I'm going to try to make some comments about tailoring that to the context in India. As you'll find out in the next half an hour or so, I have strong opinions about everything, and I'm not shy about telling you my opinion. I also often have views that are contrary to what's in the mainstream, so I'm quite a contrarian. I'm not sure I'm right, but I'm always very sure of myself here. And I would like you to challenge what I say. So I'm not going to speak for too long. I'd like to leave more time for the panelists to respond and for all of you in the audience to ask questions and tell me why I'm wrong, and I'll tell you why I'm not wrong too here. But we should have a discussion. And I think hopefully the technology will let us do that too. Now to start with, I think strategy is the organizing framework for what the job of top management is. So senior managers get their conceptual framework from strategy for what they should be doing, what the agenda for action is. But the problem is that the whole concept of strategy is very fuzzy. So I had a nice wisecrack recently that all managers agree that strategy is very important, but they cannot agree on what strategy really is here. And so we need to bring some clarity to what is strategy and how does it serve as a framework for action for managers. So I think the starting point for a strategy is the whole point of strategy is to win in competition. In fact, the origin of the word strategy is from the military context, where strategy meant the art of the general. So it's the role of the general to try to win the war. And similarly, the role of strategy in business is to win in competition. Now, this sounds very simple, but as we'll see, it's not so simple. Now, the first thing is, why can you win in competition? And the easy answer, of course, is that you have to do something different from the competition. Now, there's all those wisecrack attributed to Einstein. I'm not sure he said it, but it's often attributed to him, that insanity is doing the same thing, but expecting a different result. So if you want a different result to win, then you have to do something different from the competition. Now this sounds very obvious, but in my view, a lot of companies don't understand this very simple point. So for example, I go to a company and I ask the managers, what is your strategy? And the answer I often get is, our strategy is to produce high quality products at low cost. Now this sounds good, but it's not a strategy. Every company that I know wants to produce high quality products at low cost. This is a trite statement, it's a platitude. It doesn't say anything. I've never heard a company say, we want to produce low quality products at a high cost here. Now, of course, many companies do actually do exactly that, but not on purpose. So saying that you want to make high quality products at low cost is not saying anything. Strategy is when you make controversial choices. For example, sell direct versus sell indirect. Automate the factory versus not automate the factory. Sell high-priced products rather than lower-priced products. Go to China, not go to China. So it's when you make a choice that some other company does not make. So in my view, strategy is when you do something that another equally intelligent and smart manager chooses not to do. So my favorite metaphor for strategy is go to China or not go to China. You could have said go to India or not do it. But let's take China, since I'm talking to a lot of Indians here. China is clearly one of the most interesting markets in the world. 1.3 billion people that have been growing rather fast for the last 30 years. although they're not growing that fast these days. Growth has clearly come down in China. Anyway, because of this high growth and large size of the market, every company at least should think about going to China. And obviously most multinational companies do exactly that. But then if you look at a lot of foreign companies in China, they actually do not make money. It's not so easy to make money in China. It's a very tough market to be in. So if you're a company that goes to China, I think there is a good chance that you will lose money. And I don't mean just short term. You will lose money long term. So if you go to China, it's quite likely that you made a mistake. On the other hand, if you don't go to China, it's quite likely that you made a mistake also, and you missed out on a huge growth opportunity. So if you go to China, you might be wrong. If you don't go to China, you might be wrong. Well, now you have to make a choice. There is no middle ground here. In fact, the dumbest thing to do is to go halfway to China and sit in the ocean. Either you go to China or you don't go to China. That's it. And I think strategy is full of these polarized choices of what to do and what not to do. And they're all controversial choices. So when some companies go to China, others choose not to go to China. So for example, in automobiles, General Motors is very big in China, but Ford is not. In soft drinks, Coke is big in China, but Pepsi is not. In fast food, McDonald's is big in China, but Burger King is not. So all companies don't make the same choices. And strategy is about making these controversial choices. I said, this seems awful, but companies don't understand this. So when I look at companies that talk about strategy, they make it into a set of platitudes. Or we have a statement in the US, we call them motherhood statements. They're right, they're trite, but they don't add any value. Things like, be good to your customers. Well, of course you'll be good to your customers here. The question is, how good are you going to be here? Or listen to your, be nice to employees. Of course you're going to be nice to your employees. But the question is, what are the trade-offs you face? So strategy is about making choices. Now, in order to make choices that are controversial, there must be dissent in the company. And one of the problems I see in companies is that not only do they not tolerate dissent, they actually stifle dissent. And if there is no dissent, you cannot get different points of view. So in my view, a sign of a healthy company is where you can go to your boss and tell him or her that she's wrong and not have it be a career-limiting move. But in most companies, telling your boss you're wrong is not very good for your career. And that's the problem in companies. And I think this is particularly true in many countries in Asia. So you look at countries in East Asia, like China, Korea, Japan, they're characterized by what's called Confucian values, which is a desire for harmony, respect for authority, respect for elders, not having dissent, not disagreeing in public. This may be good for the society, although that's debatable too, but it's certainly not good for companies and for strategy. And I think some of the same problems I see is true in companies in India. Now, India, of course, doesn't have Confucian values, but still shares some of the same values about respect for elders, respect for authority. And many companies are too hierarchical, too authoritative, with power concentrated at the top in India, in my view. Now, you as a person should perhaps respect your parents and elders, but I don't think that applies to companies. Because the common assumption is that people who are older somehow get wiser with experience and get wisdom. Well, as you get older, you also become less flexible, you become more stodgy, and perhaps even senile. I'm not sure we should respect elders that much here. As an example, you might know there has been never any successful company in internet that was started by anybody over the age of 30 years old. So if you're 30 or more, you're already over the hill here. So I think you young people in the room, you have a few years more to go, and you should start a company rather than listen to your elders. But we need more dissent in companies. And not only should we not stifle dissent, we should actively encourage dissent. We want people to disagree. In fact, all learning comes out of disagreement. And to foster good strategies, it is essential to have an active involvement in a debate in companies. Now the next question is, what is this debate about? What are these controversial choices about in strategy? And in my view, there are three topics, or three buckets of choices. The first is where to compete. What business do you want to be in? What segment do you want to be in? Which customers do you want to go after? So I think of business is like a game. And the first issue is, what game do you want to play? Do you want to play poker, or do you want to play chess or bridge or mahjong? But what do you want to play? And the same thing is true in business. You have to decide what game do you want to be in? What business do you want to be in? And just because you were in that business in the past doesn't mean you have to be in that business in the future. You should decide when to change and when is that game not a good game to be in and to move into a new game. Now, when I look at a lot of companies as a generalization in India, one of the problems I think is that too many companies in India do too many different things. They don't have a focus. The word we use for them is conglomerates. That they are doing all sorts of different things. That they do everything from IT consulting to steel to cars to telecommunications. Yeah. Whereas I think some of the best companies in the world have a narrower focus. They become good at something and they do that on a large scale rather than doing too many different things. So the first issue is to decide what business do you want to be in. And obviously that's a controversial choice. The second issue is, whatever business you've chosen to be in, how are you going to get a competitive advantage in that business? I think the whole point of competitive advantage is to make more money. And there are only two ways to make more money. Either you have a higher price or you have a lower cost. I think strategy in general is very complex, but the heart of strategy is pretty straightforward. That the bulk of strategy should tell you, why will you as a company be able to charge a higher price than your competitors? So why will the customers voluntarily say that I'm willing to pay a higher price to you than to the competition? Or the second possibility is that you do not charge a higher price, but you can produce it at a lower cost, and therefore get a higher margin, of course. So you look at some of the most successful companies in the world, they have figured out some clever way to charge a higher price than the competition. This is BMW in cars, Coca-Cola in soft drinks, Qualcomm in software, Google in search engines, that you have figured out some way to charge a higher price than what the competition can do. Or the second possibility is that you don't charge a higher price, but you can just do it at a lower cost than the competition. This is Hyundai in cars, it is Dell in computers, it is Southwest Airlines in airlines, Walmart in retailing. They don't deliver a higher quality product, but they can produce a product that is comparable at a lower cost. So you've got to do one of the two. Now, of course, there is a trade-off between quality and cost. And one of the silly statements I hear from a lot of the so-called business gurus is quality is free. Well, quality is certainly not free. If quality is free, we should all be driving Mercedes cars and living at five-star hotels, yeah. There is a trade-off here, and you have to figure out how to manage that trade-off. The third issue around which strategy revolves is how to design the internal organization to implement the strategy. So here you have to talk about issues like the structure of the organization. Should it be centralized, decentralized? How do you push power lower down into the organization? What is the division? What is the department? What's the sector? Who reports to whom? How does power flow in the organization? A second big set of issues revolves around processes in the company. Processes such as information systems, planning, budgeting, reward system, performance measurement. You also have to manage the culture of the organization, the values that all the people share. This is the unstated, often, assumptions that drive a lot of decision making. And finally, you have to manage people. Who do you recruit? Who do you promote? Who do you fire? Where do you do succession planning? How do you develop the next generation of leaders? So I see three buckets of major controversial choices. What domain do you compete in? How do you get a competitive advantage in that domain? And how do you design the internal organization to implement the strategy? Then going back to the earlier question of strategies about winning. Well, one of the challenges here is how do we define winning? And in my view, a lot of companies do not use the appropriate metrics to define winning. They think size is winning, but that's not true. I can think of a lot of large companies in the world that I think are terrible companies. Yeah. Any number of companies in US, India, Japan, they are large companies, but they are not my role models. It's not customer satisfaction either. I can think of companies where customers are satisfied, but the shareholders are not. It's not brands either. I can think of companies that are wonderful brands, but are not great companies. As an example, take a company like Sony. Go out on the street and ask ordinary people, not people like all of you who are smart people in business, but ask somebody on the street, do you think Sony is a good company? And a lot of people will say yes. It has a famous brand name, it's a large company, it's an old company, has a large market share, makes innovative products like Blu-ray DVD players, but it's a terrible company. Now who says that besides me? And the answer is shareholders. The stock price of Sony today is lower than it was 30 years ago. And the whole point of a company is to create shareholder value. The point of business in a capitalistic society is to make money. And the metric for that is, what do the shareholders think, the owners of the business? And clearly it's the stock market that is putting that value on it. Now this is clearly a controversial point of view. I think that the primary objective of a company is to maximize shareholder value. But there are a lot of people who disagree with me, who say that companies should cater to a variety of stakeholders, that companies have a corporate social responsibility to business, to the society. And I do not agree. I think they have a flawed logic here. So there are two different forces pulling on companies these days. On the one side, the stock market and the shareholders are becoming more demanding and more active. I'm sure as you read the newspaper, especially about American companies, there are any number of CEOs that have been fired recently by the shareholders, not because they were terrible, but because they just don't make enough money for the company. But on the other side, I hear a lot of people in society saying that companies should have a corporate social responsibility and cater to multiple stakeholders in society. In fact, India has gone so far as to make it a law that all large companies in India must spend 2% of their profits on corporate social responsibility. I think that's a terrible idea, yeah. It's a law that makes no sense at all. Now what's the problem with this? Where is the tension in this, and why am I against the idea of corporate social responsibility? Well, we should take two different situations into account here. One is where a company does some action that improves society's welfare and simultaneously also is profitable. There are many such actions that companies can take that are good for society and improve profits. For example, you should be nice to employees, and that employees are more productive and you make more money. For example, a company like Google is famous for being very liberal in its fringe benefits. They have wonderful food at the company. They have lots of leave, they have lots of toys, they even do your dry cleaning for you. Now, this is not social responsibility. This is so that they make you stay at the company and work 12 hours a day. And employees are very productive, and Google is a very profitable company. This is good human resource practices. Companies that listen to customers. Well, of course you should listen to customers. This is not social responsibility. Or a company that produces, for example, wind turbines, and is profitable, like Suzlon in India. Well, this is not social responsibility. The customers are willing to pay a price for wind turbines, and if you can make money doing it, that's a good thing. In fact, this is the whole idea of capitalism, that you can serve your own self-interest and society's welfare simultaneously. Adam Smith, in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, figured out more than 200 years ago that the baker does not provide us bread out of the goodness of his heart. He does it because he makes money out of it. And we are better off to get bread like this. This is why capitalism works and free markets are the best way to create value in society. Now there is a second situation where what a company does to increase its profits is not good for society, or what it does to improve society's welfare reduces its profits. For example, a company can burn coal, and coal is the cheapest form of energy these days. But coal is obviously very bad for the environment. So now we have a conflict between what society wants and what the company wants. Now, expecting the company to serve society's interests in this arena, I think, is very naive. The company is not going to do it, and you'll be disappointed. If you want companies to stop burning coal, you don't need to appeal to their social responsibility. What you should do is put a tax on carbon emissions. And that is the best way to solve the problem of climate change, for example. So we need government regulation where interests of society and interests of companies diverge. And so the whole point is that managers should think about how to create shareholder value, and government should try to serve society's purposes. Of course, in this logic, I want to be careful to say how do you create shareholder value. And in my view, the way you should do that is by getting a competitive advantage in a competitive market, not through crony capitalism, not by earning what economists call rents. That is not a value-creating strategy for society. But unfortunately, in many emerging countries, including in India, much of the private wealth is created not through competitive advantage, but is created through somewhat shady means. I saw an interesting study which looked at the tremendous amount of private wealth that has been created in countries like China, India, Brazil, Russia in the last 10 or 20 years, and is disproportionately represented in sectors like natural resources, mining, real estate, construction. Why so? Because these are all sectors where government plays a large role, and the road to wealth creation has not been competitive advantage, but rather either outright corruption or some subtle form of corruption, but nonetheless corruption of the capitalistic system. So I like companies like, for example, Infosys. in India that competes on the basis of its competitive advantage rather than real estate companies that have just good linkages to some politicians. Now, getting to the context of India, I think one of the challenges for business in India is firstly to create wealth. Really, one of the major problems in India is that a large fraction of Indians are still living below the poverty line. And this is in spite of the fact that the poverty line is defined rather harshly. If we define the poverty line a little more liberally, then the fraction of Indians living below that poverty line could be as much as 50%. So you cannot eradicate or even alleviate poverty without economic growth. And clearly the private sector, business, is the engine for growth, for value creation. And we need the business sector in India to create more value. But simultaneously with creating value, it has to create more inclusive growth. That I think one of the problems in many countries in the world today, from US to India and many in between, is that income inequality is going up rather than down. This is one of the major issues in the political arena in the US in this year of elections, is the growing income inequality in the US. But the same is true in India, is the growing income inequality. The rich are getting richer, and the poor are not getting their fair share of this economic growth. So we need growth, but we also need more inclusion in society. And I think most people recognize this, and this is not an either-or proposition. It is not either you get growth or you get inclusion. You have to get both, growth and inclusion. And business is the way to go that way. Now, what is it that business can do to get inclusive growth and help lift millions of people out of poverty in India? And I think the real issue is creating jobs. So if you ask a poor person, what do you really want? And I think by far the majority of poor people say, get me a job at steady wages, at reasonable wages, under reasonable conditions. But I think a lot of the emphasis in talking about poverty alleviation has been misplaced. For example, there is a lot of romanticism around the idea of microfinance. This started in Bangladesh, but spread to India and many other countries. And the idea was that you can give small loans to poor people, and poor people will invest this small sum of money and create a thriving business and climb out of poverty. This is just not true. It doesn't happen. It sounds nice, but it doesn't happen. Now, of course, you can find some occasional anecdotes of a poor person who got a small loan and today has a thriving business. But for every such person, there are thousands of other people that did not do that. So we can celebrate this person who climbed out of poverty like this, but we should help the other people in a more effective manner. In fact, if you look at a rich, advanced country like the US, more than 90% of Americans work for a salary. They don't start businesses and they're not entrepreneurs. Why would you think that most poor people want to be entrepreneurs? They do not. So microfinance is not the solution to poverty reduction. A second thing that has often been advocated is the so-called bottom of the pyramid strategies. This was the idea that you can sell things at a low price to the poor, and this will somehow help them. This is very curious. The poor are poor not because they do not consume enough. The poor are poor because they don't earn enough. One of the celebrated examples in the BOP literature was sell them shampoo in small sachets, and they can afford to buy shampoo. Well, go talk to some poor person, and I don't think anybody says, you know, my first primary need is shampoo here. What they need is a job, and we need to create jobs. But unfortunately, the growth in India has not created enough jobs. So the record of job creation in India in the last 30, 40 years has been very poor. Whereas in China, there's been a tremendous number of jobs created. And the jobs that be created have to be appropriate to the poor. So they'll be in labor-intensive industries with low capital intensity, low requirement of skills. These are not great jobs. These are not jobs that you and I want. But this is the realistic path out of poverty. So I think what India needs to do is to create a tremendous number of jobs in labor-intensive, low-skilled sectors of the economy. Information technology sector is not going to solve the problems of India. The total number of people employed in the IT sector in India is in the range of, at the most, 1 or 2 million people out of a population of 1.3 billion. Bangalore is not the answer to the India's problems. We have to solve the problems in the larger states like Uttar Pradesh. We have to create jobs at a much larger scale. And it is the role of business to do that. And so we are not going to do it through getting into industries that emphasize automation. We're going to get it through industries that emphasize labor-intensive skills. And I think it is what India needs to do is to get into sectors like low-tech assembly, garments, shoes, toys. It's interesting that China has been the largest player in these industries. But as wages rise in China, some of these sectors are going to the other countries in Asia, like Vietnam, Bangladesh. But it's India that should be trying to get into these sectors of the economy, and it's the role of business to do that. And I think what we need is some innovation in business models and how to cater to these sectors. That we clearly have low-cost labor. We have wonderful management skills in India. We have wonderful technical skills in India. And we have to put these to use to create more inclusive growth. I'm very optimistic that young people like all of you are the answer to that. Well, I'd like to hear your views. I think I've talked for quite long, and I'd like to hear what you agree with or not, and let's have a discussion together. Thank you very much.
Disagreements with you and probably as strong views as yours. But I will first request Hemant Purohit to give his opening remarks, followed by Prasad and Anil Gupta here, and then get into more discussions and more issues which have emerged from Anil's talk today. So Hemant, may I request you to give your opening remarks, please?
Sure. Thanks, Kishore, and thanks everyone for having me here. I hope you are having an interesting session since morning. And thanks, Dr. Kelani. You had a very interesting perspective from the strategy side. So I don't have a perspective from the strategy side, but I would touch upon the point that how do you rather support strategy when it comes to doing the decision making. So I would come with that background and that perspective in terms of the information systems and in terms of the socio-technical systems, where you have people, you have organizations, and you have technology involved. And when the intersection or interaction of the three happens, how do you basically foresee the improvement in terms of supporting these kind of strategies, especially in the context of 25th century that we are really talking about in this theme. So to me, one of the key things that has changed in the recent years that you would foresee from in terms of how information systems were operating before and how there is a need for them to adapt in the current situation is the form of data, the access to data. The kinds of data about whether it is the customer's behavior, whether the behavior of the even folks from the competition side, that's actually available in the forms of attitudes and opinions. So one of the interesting points that Dr. Kanani had made about the attitude and the culture. So I'm actually a big fan about all these behavioral aspects, and I try to model those. And from that angle, what we see now is the access to the perception of our citizens. And so I want to talk about the organizations where we have actually role of citizens very much. Like, although in our earlier discussion that Dr. Kanani, the point that Dr. Kanani made about how organizations look at their shareholders rather than actually their customers. But in the 21st century, actually, there is a lot of buzz that is coming out that what are the citizens talking about, really, and what are the pain points? Because at the end of the day, really an organization is trying to figure out the pain points of the customers too. So citizens' voices, when they are being heard and when we are able to see the perceptions about whether it is brand, whether it is a product, whether their daily problems. So from that perspective, if we have to look at today's organizations and the information systems which actually support their decision making, I think there is an interesting role of also incorporating this data that we have access to now, the data about the behaviors of our end users, our citizens. So in that regard, there is now an opportunity. Yes, these are complex things, but how do you really understand the behavior of the citizens in terms of what they are talking about? But the platforms of all these social media and Web 2.0, they although someone can say their biased views, some people are going to only contribute in that. However, the small proportion is indeed vocal to bring out certain issues. Just to give an example, so we recently did a paper on gender-based violence and how actually with this thought process that there's an organization who wants to design policies about it. So there is a clear implication that yes, policies are for the purpose of society, just trying to curb this problem, but at this point, we want to assess their value in terms of seeing what citizens talk about, what citizens think, and what are citizens' attitude towards the systems. In the same way, to put a profitable business organization who wants to design the strategies, can the citizens' viewpoints about whatever their systems are, whatever their products are, can they be informing? Can they be informants for the purpose of an efficient information system? So that's one of the key things which I see in terms of what things have changed in today's era versus what was available earlier, changed in terms of the data access. Yes, they had access to their customers earlier too, but what kind of data? And here's actually an unconventional route, not just through the conventional means, what it used to be in earlier times, but now an unconventional route where people are just talking, and that from the noise of all this talking, can insights be in mind to design information system or to support information systems for better decision making. So from that perspective, it fits in the part of the thinking organizations as, are we considering organizations as stakeholders or stakeholders where just employees and just the shareholders and just the founders and owners are they the only ones, or also the people whom they are serving, the citizens. And especially it is true for the kinds of organizations where we are talking about the social impact driven organizations. We have seen tremendous growth in the social entrepreneurs coming up and trying to work at the social entrepreneurship organizations. They are trying to build those kinds of startups. For those kinds of startups, I think it's very crucial to also factor in this account of how citizens are basically, whatever attitudes they are, whatever dissent that Dr. Karnani talked about actually are being expressed there, and how that can be used in actually making decisions for the controversial subjects that has to be. So that basically brings to a point of the information systems from in the 21st century's perspective compared to what we have seen in the past times. And I would like, Mr. Muthuswamy also to go with his opinion on, and then we can basically have a discussion further.
Thank you, Hemant. And may I request now Prasad for his opening remarks before we go on to the issues raised by both Anil and Hemant now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kishore. Thank you, Hemant. Unfortunately, I'm a manager and managers don't know how to talk without slides. So I will need to use a couple of slides to start this off. Let me know when you can see the slides. And for those of you who are, maturing into would-be managers, when you complete this course, learn to make very nice decks. That's the only key to success here. So, my perspective is kind of building on the thoughts that Dr. Anil and Hemant suggested, but it's a slightly narrower focus on what we are seeing in the enterprise and in the IT space, especially in the technology world. So, in the traditional world of enterprise and IT, now to give a context, this is about somewhere upwards of $200 billion annual revenue across multiple companies, all the big brand names, and so on and so forth. And this constitutes a core component of the overall enterprise strategy. Your technology strategy is really, I would say, one of the three key pillars for building out your overall strategy. And the way it used to always be, even say 10 years back, would be that you would have this big, powerful organization within an enterprise that's known as the IT organization that would then control the technology strategy for the entire enterprise. Now, this enterprise may be in any domain. They could be in manufacturing, they could be in finance, they could be in marketing, or any other domain. It wouldn't matter. The IT organization would be the one determining the technology for the enterprise. And that in turn, determines the experience that they get to deliver to their consumers. Now, the IT organization would traditionally control everything from, the devices, what devices you get to choose, what platforms you get to work on, what sort of applications you get to run on top of those devices, and so on and so forth. And then you would also get to see an environment where you would have complete control over the policies associated with how you use those applications. All of that's changing. This is the most disruptive force in IT, and that's the end user. What's happened over the last 10 years is that as the millennials have started to enter the workforce and as they have started to become the new knowledge workers, what we see is a tectonic shift in where decisions are made as far as technology is concerned. Previously, that decision would be based off, the knowledge worker on his first day of work would walk into his office or his cube, and the workstation would have a predefined device with a predefined platform. They would have complete control, and the IT would have complete control over what you can do in your workspace. The millennials cannot accept that because they come from an environment where you have tremendous access to versatile solutions that are flexible, that can meet your needs with an infrastructure backing that is superior to or equal to a traditional enterprise IT. And in that hunt for talent, if an enterprise needs to hire the best and brightest, you have to then dramatically change the approach that you have to your IT structure. So what we see is a migration of saying decisions get centralized in a select set of people sitting in that siloed organization to all decisions being made in the lines of business. And then that decision is again being influenced by the end user. The knowledge worker chooses everything in that enterprise. So what does that mean for the suppliers? It means that you no longer can work with that environment of saying, I need to engage with a small set of people to decide the success of my product. The engineering organization within a product company today has to revise its approach. In the days before, we used to have a model of product release that used to be called as waterfall, where you would have a product release every 6 months or every 1 year. You have to now transform that entire approach from a waterfall model to an agile model, which is a release every 2 weeks, to a DevOps model where you release code as soon as you write it, An example is Facebook, which provides product releases 10 times a day, completely seamless and transparent to the user, but at the back end, people are upgrading that product every hour. Macroeconomic factors. Now this is creating a change in the approach of all technology companies, but to back that up, macroeconomic factors in both the developing as well as the developed nations have resulted in the need to change the model of spend in all enterprise customers. So what happened is, instead of the previous model where you make a huge big investment in building your infrastructure out, and then you have some periodic investments every once in a while to refresh that infrastructure, you're now having to move assets out of your premise into the cloud with the real intent of saying, I don't want to make a whole lot of investments upfront. I need to be flexible. I need to be able to scale up or down. And to make that even more interesting, the requirement is that I do not really want to commit to any spend. I do not want to be tied down to saying I have to incur a certain expense on a certain solution or technology. So as a product company, as a company that's trying to be an IT supplier, companies have to revise themselves to say that I cannot sell a product and a service. I need to start selling solutions. But even solutions won't suffice. I need to start selling outcomes. And so you face this massive change from being product-based companies to solution-based companies to being an outcome-based organization. And an outcome-based means essentially that you are going to succeed based on how much your end users consume your service and how much of that value you can generate as a share of your wallet. That's the transition that we see in this space, transitioning from becoming a business-to-business interaction to a business-for-business interaction. I'll pause here and then maybe we can discuss further in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Prasad. And we already have two very different perspectives to the discussion we are having today, from behavioral aspects to the impact of the changing environment in the IT segment, the disruptions taking place. May I now call on Anil Gupta to give his opening remarks and set off the debate. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Kishore. So I have a lot of points to make, but I'd just like to mention to Dr. Karnani, I'd really like to invite you to come to India and see what is literally a tsunami of change is happening because of CSR and because of microfinance. And this is not in onesie twosies, this is in the hundreds, maybe even the thousands, children of day laborers who now work for Infosys. That is the kind of change that is happening, and it's happening a lot. It's happening because of CSR. But I don't want to get into this debate because it is not the focus. But Prasad, I want to thank you because I think you've brought the discussion back to really something right now, which is most important, is the theme of the conference, which is recontouring. So rather than get into the debate about strategy and so on, I want to focus only on the recontouring. And by recontouring, I think most of recontouring has to do with disruptions. And Prasad, you touched upon that and how the millennials are changing the workplace and so on. And I think a couple of speakers yesterday also referred to it. So, and this is especially appropriate because right behind me, sitting here, there are about 100 of these millennials, and they're really who this conference is for, and I'd like to really involve them in the discussion. Of course, I'm sure Kishore will do that as a moderator. But I think the workplace is going to change, and it's going to change massively over the next few years. And it has to do, for example, with the kind of technologies that the millennials are bringing to the office. I've seen, not just in millennials, even in my generation, actual knockdown, drag-out kind of fights over whether Android or iOS is going to be used in the office space and so on. So HR, which we discussed yesterday, we had a speaker on HR, that is really going to change, and really HR managers will have to be on their toes to manage this shift. You call it a tectonic shift, and I agree, this tectonic shift in the marketplace. And it has to do with people working from home, people working from cafes, people working like in Google, people working in the garden or wherever they feel like working and working with whatever technologies they feel like working. So that is something I really think that the panel should discuss and focus on. There's some other things too that I want to point out. Yesterday, a couple of the speakers mentioned the driverless cars. Somebody also mentioned how the family is being fragmented by the technology because every member of the family has their own screen. And these are the kinds of things that managers are going to have to deal with. Let me give you two very simple examples. At the start of the conference, we had Dada Vaswani's message about how businesses need to relate to society and need to have some moral virtue and so on. Now that's a debate that we can have, but how it relates to this, I'll give you two examples. One is this family fragmentation. Should a manager try to create products which encourage disruption of families? And do they have the right and do they have the power to do that? Let me give you another example. Driverless cars. I think many people have already talked about this. With driverless cars, you could have a situation where a car is about to have an accident and it is programmed to try and save the driver, or rather the passenger in the car, or it may have to make a choice between killing one of two people. If it swerves to the left, it kills one person. If it swerves to the right, it kills a different person. These kind of moral judgments have to be made by the car, and actually obviously it's not the car, but it's the programmers behind it and the managers who design these kinds of products. These are the kinds of things that these managers sitting behind me or future managers sitting behind me have to deal with. I'd love to talk about these issues.
Thank you, Anil. I'm going to go back a little bit on some of the aspects that Anil brought up and which Anil Gupta here also touched upon about social responsibilities, Anil. And I also have some pretty strong views which are probably a little contrary to yours, which you expressed. So I want to bring up a few things which I recently read in the Harvard Business Review, some recent survey that they had done of the best performing CEOs. And I will spend a couple of minutes before I come to my question to Anil on how they did it and what was the summary of the results. So they evaluated the CEOs worldwide on two factors, financial and non-financial, and 80% of the evaluation was on financial and 20% on the other non-financial issues. And obviously the financial were the total shareholder return and changes in market capitalization, but the non-financial issues were environmental responsibilities of that company, the social responsibilities and the governance. And the top 30 companies, 19 were from Europe, 9 from US, and 1 from Japan and 1 from Brazil. And the top position was from a Danish company called Novo Nordisk. And he has spoken quite a bit about how social responsibilities is actually a financial issue in the long run. And I'll tell a couple of his issues so that I can, so that Anil can react on that. But a very interesting fact also brought up was that Warren Buffett was not in the top 100 of this list. A person who is known for his wealth creation over such a long period of time. And even if 80% of the weightage was to financial factors, he was not in the top 100. His score on social and economy and on governance was 798 out of 907 companies. So, obviously, I mean, there is a different aspect of looking at CEOs and leaders who are giving financial performance, increasing shareholder value, but not ignoring or not at least keeping the social aspects absolutely away from it. And a couple of just points on the social issues which Lars Sorensen, the CEO of Node or Nordisk, talks about in this is that surprisingly, he says, is that the goal of the company is to eradicate or cure diabetes completely in 15 years. And 80% of their revenues comes from drugs for diabetes. Yeah. And then he goes on to talk about CSR. And he says that if you do invest, if the company does invest in these three factors, the social responsibilities, it maximizes the value of the company over a longer period of time, and it becomes financial issues. For example, if you do not follow the environmental norms, like you mentioned in the coal industry, and equipment manufacturers do not bring in equipment which does lesser harm to the environment than it does now, or the coal industry does not reduce its economic the fallout, the environmental fallout, the government will intervene to bring in taxes and other regulations, stricter regulations to make that happen, which means higher costs in the future. Yeah. So, even if you look at the other thing, that if companies do not fulfill their social responsibilities to the community, again the government can intervene. Like you rightly pointed out, in India, the government of India has brought out a law that 2% of your profit needs to be spent on that. So in a way, these factors in the long term can become financial issues. So is it still your view that the focus entirely 100% should be on maximizing shareholder value and wealth creation, and not really keep these aspects of environmental, social, and governance aspects in the picture of business strategy?
Yes, this is a good debate to have, and we can have it some today, and sometime in the future we should get together and have a longer discussion on this here. Yes, my view is that companies should be 100% focused on maximizing shareholder value, and the government should take care of these social issues. And the trouble is that a lot of companies talk about this, but they don't do it. And we end up with the worst of both worlds. Let me give you one example from India. So, a company that talks a lot about social responsibility is Unilever. If you go to the website for Unilever, it's full of statements about social responsibilities at the core of their culture, it's at the core of their strategy. And their CEOs, current CEO as well as the previous one, frequently give speeches about responsibility of the company and how they want to be an integral part of society. So I did a case study on one of the products that Unilever sells in India. It's called Fair and Lovely. It's a skin whitening cream. It's one of the most profitable products that Unilever sells in India, in Southeast Asia, Middle East, Africa. It's a high growth product with very high profit margins. And it's a product that is targeted a lot at poor women. And in countries like India, there is a bias that somehow being fairer is better here. And now the question is this socially responsible? And I think it's extremely irresponsible. Now, of course, Unilever did not create this bias, but exploits this bias. And I'm sure all of you have seen some ads for Fair and Lovely in India. It's one of the most advertised products in India. it often shows you a picture of a woman, somewhat dark looking, who is very unhappy. And then her father or her mother or a friend tells her to use Fair and Lovely. And after 4 weeks, she becomes fair. And the payoff is romance, a boyfriend or a husband, and a higher paying job. And she becomes very happy. Now, if you believe this, there are lots of other stories I can tell you too here. And Unilever not only thinks this is not bad, it says this empowers the woman. This is a perversion of truth. I think, imagine a young girl growing up in India being bombarded with these ads from the age of 8 or 9 years old that she is too dark and the only way to get better is to become fair. And by the way, this product doesn't work either. It's basically a sunscreen. If you are dark, nothing is going to make you fair. And there's nothing wrong with being dark. And so I don't see what is so socially responsible about this product. But it's a company that talks a lot about social responsibility. And I think there are lots of interesting studies that show that companies that talk the most about being socially responsible are often the ones that are the least responsible. So like your example about coal, or the one that I brought up. If you look at utilities that talk the most about being socially responsible, are the ones that actually burn the most coal. And so we want companies to stop doing this. We should have strict regulation to do it, not social responsibility to do it. Yeah.
Okay.